So again, like, is your contention that like Cuba started out as a democratic form of socialism?
Didn't it sort of?
Not that I know of.
Really?
Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air.
All right, so Ben Burgis talked to Jillian Michaels. Ben Burgis is a pretty well-known debater in the left-wing sphere. He's been around for a while. He's like a Marxist socialist, openly so. And so he tends to go and debate people who are always saying, hey, I want to debate more leftists. I want to debate these Marxists, these cultural Marxists or whatever. And Ben Burgis is normally one of the ones who will pipe up and say, I'm down to debate you. And he has this good faith approach. He really just wants to go and talk to people about this stuff because he doesn't feel like people hear the argument about socialism enough. And I think that's true. He had conversations like that with Charlie Kirk. I also referenced recently that he spoke to Joe Rogan. They had less of a debate. He just even preempted going on Joe Rogan by saying, this is going to be just a conversation. Like, we just chatted. I didn't go in there to go bust his balls. That's his approach. He takes the same approach to this Jillian Michaels debate. This is a 2-hour long conversation in Jillian's normal ADHD style. She's very all over the place, as well as just like learning about a lot of this stuff for the first time and also learning about it through ChatGPT and other AIs and large language models. So that's her approach, and it leads to a very unfocused conversation, but they do talk about a few different issues and different policy stuff, and there's this sort of puzzling question of why Jillian Michaels is oriented to the right at all. She doesn't seem to have many left-wing positions, but then it seems like the only thing that she can really say she believes in strongly is like regulation of, I don't know, big pharma and big ag. And so, you know, that just doesn't really jive with like the pro-capitalist laissez-faire type of arguments that she seems to be sympathetic to. But it's really just because like she doesn't know a lot about this stuff and she's kind of just referencing conservative arguments spit out by ChatGPT. So in this first clip, she starts out armed with a bunch of talking points about like communism and communists like Che Guevara and Cuba and Mao, I'm sure, and all this stuff. So she starts out wanting to talk to him like defend communism, defend socialism. He approaches it by saying, I'm a democratic socialist, and successfully orients the conversation away from her sort of anti-communist gish gallop into a more substantive policy debate. So here's the beginning here.
And so that concept doesn't seem to work. You've got the Soviet Union, USSR, didn't work. Poland in the 70s and 80s, didn't work. East Germany, didn't work. Romania, same time, didn't work. Hungary, no. Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Albania, no. Yugoslavia, no. This is where it's like, this is what I know. Mao is China. Good Lord. North Korea, no. Cambodia.
So you know, the first thing you said when you were starting all
this is obviously, it's like a list of 50-something countries.
Was that you had country after country after country where things, you said, started out with good intentions, but then they went to shit.
I'm guessing they did. They made these promises to the people.
Like, as far as I know, none of those countries, right, started out as a democratic kind of socialism and became an authoritarian kind of socialism. I think, as far as I know, the only case in the history of the world that looks anything like that is Russia, and even that, I think, it's a pretty murky example.
Think of those promises, like, we're going to distribute the wealth, we're going to make it fair. It's all kind of that, and then they end up.
So again, like, is your contention that like Cuba started out as a democratic form of socialism?
Didn't it sort of?
Not that I know of.
Really?
I mean, it's because it seems to me that looking out at the history of the world, we have a zillion examples of democratic capitalist countries that become authoritarian. In fact, often become authoritarian because they, in the name of anti-communism.
Can you give me examples?
Sure. So, I mean, Italy and Germany, right, are both cases of capitalist countries where, when fascists came to power, they did it in to a great degree because they said, oh, you need to support us, right, to stop communism. Chile in 1973 is a great example. You have democratically a socialist president. Salvador Allende is elected to office. He's overthrown by General Augusto Pinochet. Starts a reign of terror.
This is well handled, and there's a separate conversation to be had about actual communism, the difference between countries like Cuba and China, for example, or what it is that makes China a successful project, whether you call it socialist or communist or whatever you call it. But Ben, I think wisely, gets the conversation back on terms of democratic socialism. because this is now a conversation, instead of arguing for like the most extreme versions of communism that ChatGPT and Jillian Michaels can sort of imagine. Instead, they're talking about this sliding scale of regulation and deregulation, where, you know, in countries like Venezuela, and then they get into this comparison of a country like Venezuela and like the Nordic countries, and how much of their economy has been socialized or nationalized. And like a lot of right-wingers, especially the undereducated ones, they don't tend to think of it that way in terms of like how much of the economy, how many different types of commodities have been decommodified or nationalized, but rather it's more about like how much power does the government have and how bad are the guys who are running the government. And so in this next part, this is where it gets kind of interesting as far as Jillian goes, because in this and her conversation with Sam Cedar and other times I've heard her talk, she does mention this idea of like regulation. Like she wants to regulate companies that she feels like are exploitative, but it's this different, more conservative idea where instead of like they're exploiting the workers and making off with the profits, Jillian seems pretty in favor of that part. But it's this idea of like they're poisoning us or something, or obviously the people who have that much power would have nefarious intentions. So here is her describing what she views as like, you know, the top-down powers making us fight on a horizontal level, which is, I think, an interesting point when it comes to her specifically.
I think that the horizontal fight is manufactured on purpose to prevent people like you and I, even though I could never solve these problems, but to prevent people like you and I talking. I really believe that. Because if I said, Ben, I think we have the same goal. We want to fix healthcare, right? Forget all the things you think we disagree on. Okay. We don't like that people are dying. This is terrible. We want people to get care. Okay. Then it becomes, you know, like an arena of ideas. And this is like, well, okay, I like your idea here, but here's where I think it's flawed. Well, Jillian, you've got a point there, but here's where it falls apart. And then you've got this collective effort to solve a problem. But instead it's like, you know, MAGA, the racist, and then libtard, socialist, commie, and we're effed, and they win. That's why I am so desperate to talk to people and to see more people talk, and the people that do it get killed. They get killed. Fred Hampton, who was one of the young Panthers, they killed him over this. Literally, the FBI killed him. And whether, you know, you had I thought you had a beautiful conversation with Charlie, whether you liked it or not.
I liked it.
I thought it was very respectful and very civil and made me feel great to watch.
Yeah, so the most important question here is, who is the they that win if we are fighting each other on a horizontal level? Because a lot of people will say this from many, many different political orientations, like, oh, the right and the left shouldn't fight each other, and really we're all sort of on the same side. And that is objectively true, but the problem is, around what type of idea is that mass group of people going to coalesce around? And so when Jillian Michaels says, you know, we lose and they win when we're all fighting each other, the leftists and the socialists will very specifically tell you that the they that wants us to be fighting each other instead of them is capitalists, people who are making off with all of the profits from this sort of unfair orientation of society. Very straightforward. Now, I think Jillian believes that too, but she would caveat it with something else. There's also something, she would go, yeah, but I mean, don't you think? But who else are you pointing to? You could also say that there are people who rise to power in communist nations or monarchical nations, you know, that hoard wealth, etc. But when it comes to who wields the most power, especially in America, it's unquestionably capitalist. And so somebody like Jillian, who wants to seem like she's coming off critiquing power, even though she consistently defends power, she is going to say that she opposes like the consolidated power of those corporations, etc., but is supporting politicians like Trump that actively gut the government's ability to limit those corporations. So in practice, Jillian Michaels is 100% pro-corporation. She just, I don't know, doesn't realize it or is lying about it. But there's also this seamless transition into talking about Fred Hampton, which, like, you know, for all the fear of communism that she has and communists and socialists, I mean, Fred Hampton is definitely on the extreme end of that, certainly based on her worldview. But you can see the kind of slopification. She's learning about all this stuff for the first time. And I assume the reason she's bringing up Fred Hampton is because he talked a lot about, like, the Rainbow Coalition and kind of defied orthodoxy at the time by talking with the more white white supremacist coded groups, white groups, in order to build a stronger working class coalition. But again, all of this was to the end of like certainly not regulating companies, but seizing companies, seizing the property of these companies and redistributing it. That was like the goal of the Black Panthers, and power to them. You know, so somebody who's critiquing the very concept of a government run store, grocery store in New York City is not exactly, you know, I just don't really get where the Fred Hampton admiration comes from. But then, you know, going straight from that into Charlie Kirk gives you a little more insight on it there. So in this last clip, this is the longest clip, and they start by having kind of an interesting discussion about, they start by talking about the publicly owned grocery stores in New York. So you can see a little bit of Jillian's lack of understanding there, which again, just makes it weird that she even brought up the Black Panthers. One of the main things that they did was deliver groceries to people for free. But she then transitions from talking about that to this Jonestown talking point that apparently she got from Glenn Beck about how Jonestown was an early version of socialism, even though she doesn't even understand the point she's making. And then, in typical Jillian Michaels fashion, devolves into just asking AI about it. So thankfully, Ben calls her out about that here, although a little bit softly. So here's that.
You got the freaking food stamps. You preserve the competitiveness on infrastructure costs. Isn't that a tool that we could use? What am I not?
Well, we already have food stamps. I mean, my understanding is that part of the idea here, when you talk about food deserts, is
New York's not a food desert?
The whole city. No, food stamps are something that, you know, that is, you know, you're going to have the government bureaucracy to decide, you know, whether you're quite poor enough to get it.
Be able to use a government grocery store. I shouldn't get food stamps. I shouldn't.
Why not?
Because I don't need the help.
So,
and I would argue that.
I mean, you said earlier. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't want to interrupt you, but
no, please.
I was just going to say, like you said earlier, you send your kids to public schools, right? Should you be able to use a free government school?
God. Okay, but I pay more in taxes for them to use that school.
Okay, but the same thing would be true for any kind of government service, right?
I feel like such a piece of crap doing that. I guess I look at these social services as a quote safety net, but not a hammock for our most vulnerable, and I'm not that at the moment.
Sure, but look, I mean, you know, if we have
people can't do that shit. They did it in the Jamestown colony, and all the working people were super mad.
I think that if you told me you want to talk about the Jamestown colony, I could have spent some time on that. My vague memory, it's been years since I've actually my understanding is that the Jamestown colony, they're still ultimately they're still ultimately paying people in the the company back in England, right? So I think that's a little bit misleading.
Okay, the connection between the Jamestown colony and communism centers on how the settlement was originally structured and why it collapsed. While communism as a political ideology didn't exist in 1607, the Virginia Company established Jamestown under a strict communal property system.
Okay, but the part that seems like most important there is the Virginia Company.
Okay, often described by historians as a corporate form of proto-socialism.
I mean, what does that even mean?
I actually don't know. I was going to ask you. The failure of this system and the subsequent pivot to private property is one of the earliest and most dramatic case studies in economic incentives on American soil, the common store system. When investors of the Virginia Company funded the expedition, they required the colonists to operate under a charter that eliminated private ownership and individual profit. The mechanism of this early economic structure was straightforward. The common storehouse, all food was gathered, crops were grown, trade goods acquired, like timber or fur, had to be placed into a central shared storehouse, equal distribution. Every colonist was fed and supplied equally from this storehouse, regardless of how much or how little they contributed to the labor. The rich guys didn't want to do it. No private land. The land was owned entirely by the company. Individuals.
But I mean, that's a private company, right? So when you said no private land, you mean that they didn't let them own any of it, right? But it's still a private company that's owned all the land.
But it's under this concept of the collective, the warmth of the collective. No, human nature ran against the design, and then they started killing each other until they let them own their own land.
Okay, but again, it's not that let them own their own land because before it was nationalized, it's let them own their own land because before it was owned by this private company.
I don't know what proto-socialism, forgive me.
Sure.
I don't know what the heck that means, proto-socialism.
I mean, I can unsympathetically, I could say that like what it sounds to me is like Gemini is summarizing it's like
with the
Gemini is summarizing the argument that people like Glenn Beck make, and it's sort of trying to like capture the argument by sort of fudging the difference by saying, okay, well, it's not socialism, but it's like proto-socialism, so it's like almost like it. And okay, it's a corporate form.
But they had to share all this stuff, and their human nature would not allow it.
So because again, all the profits are going to the Virginia company, right? It's still a private company.
But isn't that socialism too? Like if you say they were the governing body, though there was no government in place at the time, so. I guess so, but they were also the governing body, and they're the ones that decided.
So if the governing body is a private corporation, that doesn't sound like socialism to me. That sounds like RoboCop.
Yeah, so I mean, this point she's making about Jonestown is really dumb, and the reason ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever she's using is defaulting to calling it proto-socialism is because there's really no basis upon which you could call it socialism. This emerged before any version of socialist thought did, and yet they're trying to point to the idea that this was like a communal version of society, that the idea was there was no private property for the people who were living there, because there was in fact private property. All of it was private property owned by the Virginia company, and the whole point of the enterprise was to make a profit for that company. So there is this idea that they were all to like share the work equally, but this idea that accurately reflects the incentives that people would have under a socialist society is just not true, and it fell apart for so many reasons that have nothing to do with that. Just a dumb point, completely partisan. It takes a hack like Glenn Beck to put something out there, but that stuff, if you look it up, there's a ton of articles from think tanks, the Cato Institute, etc., making that argument. And because of that, it's kind of made its way into the zeitgeist. And so, when somebody like Jillian Michaels searches ChatGPT, that shit comes up, and it all kind of just enters the muck of human consciousness. And that's kind of the end result of all this AI. And definitely the goal of projects like Grok is to purposely add more stuff like that in the mix and favorite. So Ben does a good job in this debate, considering that he's talking to somebody who's like completely misunderstanding this actual sliding scale that she herself is referencing. She talks about balance and how she wants to have a balanced society between, essentially capitalist interests and union organizing and the interests of workers. And so anybody who says that from this kind of pseudo-egalitarian perspective that Jillian is coming from, point out that the place we're at in America is very far right wing. And so if what you want is balance in terms of regulation and unionization, then we need to move to the left from where we're at. And so, I mean, until Jillian Michaels arrives at that conclusion, she's not really being intellectually honest. Before I go, also, I want to acknowledge that last week I was wrong about something. I said last week during the primary elections in LA that there were still a lot of votes to be counted, which there were, and I thought that Steyer had a better chance of beating out the Republican and making it to the runoff election in the governor's race. And I thought that Nithya Raman, the more left-leaning candidate in the mayoral race, had less of a chance of overtaking the Republican, and that one was probably sewn up. I was wrong about that. It's the reverse. Looks like Tom Steyer is not going to make it through, although it's not a done deal yet, most of the way there, and Nithya Raman has made it through. So she will be facing Karen Bass in the upcoming runoff election for mayor of Los Angeles. It should be an interesting race. Many more conversations to be had about socialism abound. Karen Bass will be the moderate choice in this election, which will be interesting, and surely people like Jillian Michaels will have a lot to say about Nithya Raman's policies, which are no doubt going to be attempting to appeal more to the left. So that will be interesting. Republicans are crying because their Republican candidate got beat out in that race, but they're still going to have Steve Hilton run and lose in the governor's race to corporate Democrat Javier Becerra. So as of right now, that looks like the rundown, and I'll let you guys know if anything else changes.